Hello, and welcome to another edition of Champion Briefs Video Topic Analysis. I'm Daniel Shatzkin, the editor-in-chief of Champions Briefs, and today I'm joined with one of our fellow writers, Charles Karcher. Charles, we're going to be talking about the November-December topic. That topic is a pretty interesting one where we're dealing with a federal jobs guarantee. I've judged two tournaments. I know you've judged a tournament on the topic so far. I haven't heard anything specifically like out there that's crazy definitionally on the topic. The only thing I've heard is kind of some specific job guarantee programs. There's been rural job guarantee programs, green job guarantee programs. Have you heard anything kind of out there or crazy definitions wise?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. I'm really excited. In terms of definitions, the one thing that I encountered this past weekend when I was judging an elimination round was the negative using definitions, very just like commonly accepted definitions of the resolution to generate competition on a counter plan. It wasn't even like textual competition. It was definitions to justify like functional competition. And it was pretty much a consult UN counter plan. And the argument was pretty much that, the AF had made an argument that, like a permutation argument, saying that that is an example of the normal means of the AF. And the way the negative responded was that no, like a guarantee means that there's certainty, and also just like the resolved in the resolution implies like immediate, things like that. Aside from that, I haven't heard any crazy affirmative arguments in terms of definitions.
Yeah, same. I think it's a pretty straightforward topic, what it's asking. Even if you try to break down the words a little bit, it's pretty much the United States is going to give a federal jobs guarantee. There's not much to break down out of it.
Yeah, it's pretty,
It's pretty simplistic there. I guess on a framework level, I heard mostly util rounds over the last couple of tournaments that I've judged. It was mainly util versus some form of maybe action theory or like capitalism for cap-based framework.
It's interesting because what I've been seeing debaters do nowadays, and since I've graduated, so the past like 3 years, I've seen debaters use util frameworks, but for like traditionally non-util AFs. So for example, debaters will use like a degrowth argument or like a DDEV argument, which it's known by in policy, like with a util framework saying that, pain is bad and pleasure is good, but then they go on to make arguments for like triggering a job guarantee in order to like devolve the economy, which then in turn solves existential threats and stuff like that. So again, like, yes, a lot of util arguments, but some of the contention level offense is counterintuitive to what you would usually expect from like just a typical scenario and plan AF.
Yeah, I've definitely heard a couple of collapse the system affirmatives. I've heard some affirmatives that were like create government-sponsored collectives. So they were like anti-capitalist affirmatives.
Okay.
So like government collectives with guarantees in them that would eventually like remove private industry. I've seen a couple of things like that on the affirmative, but on the AF side, I guess it was mainly util. The one time I didn't see a util AF was a civic republicanism affirmative that basically said, it's the government responsibility like to promote these forms of job guarantee because it promotes faith within the government and it creates like a popular feedback loop within democracy of like good governance and people believing in the government and like the government in turn being good. It was not the greatest app, I'll admit. It probably could have been built up a lot better than it was, but it was built on civic republicanism.
Right.
And
that
just
makes
kind
sense.
of engagement in government activities.
Yeah, right. Another app that I saw, which I found really interesting, because I think if a debater wanted to read capitalism arguments on this topic, I think for once they probably can go definitively both AF and neg. But I think that like a topical AF action on this topic probably is in the realm of like leftism, anti-capitalism, because full employment is something that typically isn't seen as something that's possible under capitalism. So, I mean, that's a debate to be had. But the reason why I was struck by this AF is because it was a non-topical like communism AF, but I didn't. It was a good app. I really respected the scholarship of it. It was like very well put together, and the student obviously put time and energy into it. But on a topic like this, like if you were a CAP debater, I don't get why you wouldn't just affirm the topic, because it probably allows for like a good substance debate where you can actually debate about the political economy. But I mean, it was a good app regardless, but that's another thing I saw.
Let's talk about actually that issue of full employment that you brought up, because I heard it on a lot of rounds, and I think it's a pretty important issue because I think a lot of affirmatives are trying to claim that they solve for unemployment in general and cause full employment. Um, is there a mandate for anybody to get a job with a federal jobs guarantee? Like, have you seen anything about that? Because I personally have, like, I know I voted neg a couple of times because the neg just had an argument where it was like, just because the jobs are guaranteed doesn't mean people actually are going to take them.
You know,
Like,
that's really interesting. And I feel like that gives way very easily to one of those interesting like topicality critique double binds. But in this case for LD, it might be like either like, you know, they don't defend mandatory jobs, which is a link into a T violation, or they do, which proves like a coercion link on like a content C or something like that. And I haven't seen that yet. That's just amusing that I had. But like you said, I don't think that a jobs guarantee does have an enforcement mechanism that people have to work. And if it did, that just gives way to a lot of critical grounds. But that
I
just
actually had a counter plan that was just, mandate 100% employment through federal jobs. And it was like, that solves the actual impacts of the AF because all the impacts were unemployment based impacts. So
right.
it was like, no, but everybody has to have a job. And it was not like the worst counter plan in the world based on what the AF was.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting. That's one of those tricky, like just one line counterplans that can end the debate just because the app just doesn't solve something that should. And you might not realize it because you often assume that, you know, the resolution is right. You know, you assume that the resolution is fine in its enforcement mechanism, but sometimes it isn't, and it doesn't have an enforcement mechanism. So you need to have something supplemental, which honestly is unfortunate for affirmative debaters because like if they stray too far outside of like, you know, normal means or like whatever's in the literature, then because I mean, since we're talking about this topic, like it's evidence that like it's not spoken about in the literature. If it is, it's not really heard in debate yet on this topic. So I think that it's just unfortunate because it's very easy to be extra topical if you like try to be perfect, you know. So
Yeah, I think a lot of the green jobs apps are extra topical because they're green investment and also green jobs
oh
guarantee.
yeah, for
Um,
sure.
yeah, because there was a really good another advantage counter plan that was run where it was instead of green jobs guarantee, it was green investment. And it actually used the app's solvency advocate who concluded that green investment was enough. I believe the author was Steiner, but I may be wrong on that one.
That's
Where
actually really interesting.
yeah, where green job investment or green investment was enough. We didn't need a federal jobs guarantee, and that the author actually said the federal jobs guarantee may harm green investment in the transition. So it's definitely an interesting argument because green jobs guarantee is another one of those util arguments that I've heard a lot of.
That's one thing just generally that I really appreciate about policy debate that I want to see more of an LD debate is just recutting evidence and putting it in the one NC, just like, you know, insert school code here reads blue instead of yellow, and then you just reread the evidence in a recut way. And it's just perceptually it just looks really good. And if you're doing that, that also means that you're going to be ahead on that part of the flow because you wouldn't be doing it if it wasn't strategic. So
Yeah, I think one of the problems with the literature on this topic is that a lot of the authors hedge kind of their arguments within their own articles, so they're arguing against themselves a lot of like, well, there could be other programs that work, and this may be problematic. And I'm not really sure why it's unique with the jobs guarantee, especially the green jobs guarantee. It could be just because the language around environmental spending has always been a zero sum game kind of,
right.
where everything always will trade off. We can't ever just increase total environmental spending,
Right.
that the authors tend to write in the same fashion.
Yeah. That makes sense.
But I've found that to be a slight issue with some of the green job stuff, is that the authors talk about a lot of trade-offs that could end up coming with the programs.
Is that something that is good? I don't know if you want to go into the disad ground yet, but is that something you think is good for disad grounds?
I do. I think there is, I mean, the arguments for the spending disad are probably not as good.
Yeah.
I think that the spending disad is kind of outweighed by new revenue sources that it creates. Like,
yeah,
there was a piece of evidence that I also read that talked about for every 4 federal jobs created, 1 private job is created.
Right.
So that shows that private industry is still successful and still growing at some rate when they've enacted job guarantees. So I don't know if spending disads and econ disads are the right route on this topic. But I think there are some maybe like some leadership disads that we can maybe get at, some tech leadership stuff. There's some arguments that federal initiatives don't actually like increase technology. They use what's available at the moment to do what they need to. So it's not as like inventive.
And that can be particularly concerning in the green sector.
Exactly.
Which that would be an interesting interaction. But on
especially whole res apps.
Right. Yeah. Right.
Where you're talking infrastructure and like they're just going to be building with diesel.
Yeah. Yeah. I think one thing that is on my mind is whether or not durable fiat solves these econ DAs, like spending and econ. It's particularly with spending. I just would find it hard to vote against an argument that, you know, if the affirmative answer is like durable fiat probably solves like budgetary issues. Unless the negative had a very convincing argument about why the normal means budget would still trigger the link, that would be really difficult for me to, you know, adjudicate, because I just think that's a convincing argument.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen budgets getting higher and higher, and we haven't necessarily seen the link. I think a better link to some sort of an econ scenario comes from kind of an old school argument called business confidence.
Yeah, BizCon, yeah.
Yeah, BizCon.
Yeah.
Haven't seen it as much in LD like nowadays, and you don't even see it as much in policy nowadays, but the whole link is predicated off of the confidence of the business sector in the economy. Right. And so it's not necessarily about spending, but whether like businesses like the plan and business leaders like the plan. And there could be an argument that like private sector businesses really don't like the plan, and that could tank things like the stock market and the GDP. But I think the last 6 months have also kind of put a damper on a lot of the econ DAs, because just like, where's our nuke war?
Right. But also, like, so 2 things on that. First is that now that the market has stabilized with the new election and the results incoming, I think that that's probably a good uniqueness argument. That's a good uniqueness argument if you wanted to read a BizCon DA, just because like we're finally stable after months, but it's obviously still fragile. So that's probably pretty good uniqueness. The second thing is, just to take it a step further, is do you think the RegNeg counterplan, regulatory negotiations, would apply for this topic? And if so, would it solve the BizCon disad? And just for our viewers that might not know that terminology, the regulatory negotiation counterplan is when you pretty much propose the plan to lobbyists and other like influential people that are in government that have ties to business, and basically they just hash it out. The government goes in saying, we want to pass this law. What can we do to make it the best for your businesses? What do you think about that, Shatzkin?
I mean, it's basically like consult the business sector counterplan, right?
Right.
So like the biggest fear is the business sector says no, lobbies against the plan, creates further backlash if the plan is forced through. That's like, you know, the problem, I guess, with you know, any type of consult counterplan is like, what do you do if they say no? Do you still do the plan, or do you stop? I mean, there are some counterplans that garner links off of doing the plan when they say no. In this case, I think it would definitely avoid especially if they say yes. Like if you have a thing that would be like business sector agrees, leads to stable growth or something like that,
Right.
creates higher demand, especially for some of those like, household goods. If you have higher spending ability from like households and everything, you're going to get people who are going to be more willing to buy TVs. They're going to be more willing to buy those consumer electronic goods and everything like that.
Right.
So the business sector may be in line with it, but they need to probably be brought into the fold instead of like, there's probably some argument that says like the business sector doesn't like large federal jobs programs without being consulted.
Right. Right.
Yeah, I'm sure there's some sort of discussion about that out there, but yeah, that could, a regular consult the business sector counterplan
Right.
basically would probably be strategic on this topic.
Agreed.
One thing, we're in the post-COVID, we're still really in COVID,
Yeah.
but like they're calling it the post-COVID economy, which doesn't make sense. It's the like, in COVID economy that we're dealing with right now.
Right.
I saw a lot of COVID recovery apps that dealt with like putting people to work for COVID recovery, contact tracers, building up medical infrastructure for both this pandemic and potential future pandemics. I thought some of those were good arguments, but some of those were problematic, particularly putting people in factories
Yeah.
right now, like,
Yeah.
might be an issue.
I think it's actually interesting you brought that up because I have not judged that or an app like that yet. But I was just having a conversation earlier today with one of my fellow coach friends who was talking to me about linking that app to like a biopolitical like Foucault critique. And he
I
wasn't as
agree.
familiar with Foucault as like I guess he thought I was. Not that I'm like a Foucault expert or anything, but like he was asking me about it, and it's intuitively a good argument. But the problem is that the link evidence that he was cutting was about how COVID is just like the COVID response is already insanely biopolitical and like surveillance and control and everything like that. So even though critiques don't have to be unique like a disad does, it's just not persuasive when the link evidence is literally like, oh yeah, we are now living in like a biopolitical society because of COVID. And it would be hard to convince that like the app would somehow make that worse. And it would just be an easy like uniqueness overwhelms the link argument for me by the affirmative.
There's some questions about the technology with it, right? And like normalizing contact tracing through like cell phone expansion and everything like that, that I can see. But yeah, I don't know really if like the app is a unique link into that system or if that system is going to exist. If the app
Right.
maybe just makes it a little wider and worse,
Yeah,
is that a unique reason to reject the app?
exactly.
I think there's some better arguments on biopower about putting people into the panoptic work state.
Right.
You have like computer monitors on work that like watch you while you're working.
Right.
Um, there are people currently that have like eye tracking software with their computers. I know it's a big thing with like the proctoring software that colleges are using in a lot of areas, and it's also being done in some workplaces where they're using eye tracking software to make sure you're actually looking at your computer while you're working.
Right.
And there's a lot of security issues when it comes to that, when especially biopolitical, where it's like how much control over the people are they always being watched? When are they being watched? Zoom work makes it way worse because it's like there are some offices that make every worker log into a Zoom call in the morning and like they're working on the Zoom call the whole day. And it's a
Right.
panoptic state. It like literally is. And if the
Exactly.
government would operate like that, it becomes problematic.
Yeah,
Um,
I think that it's interesting because the I think some economists see a jobs guarantee as something that eventually people that use the guarantee might get put back into the private sector, just because like it might just be a cycle where like eventually the private sector expands because of more consumer spending. They need more jobs there. So in a way, you could almost conceptualize a jobs guarantee from this critical lens as like a funnel of the reserve army of labor into good government jobs, but then eventually just into like mega corporations, which is concerning because if it's just a funnel into like Amazon, warehouse jobs, that's probably not the best in the context of surveillance.
Yeah.
So
Um, so I want to go kind of a link into some other critical areas. One of the issues that I thought of immediately with this was a federal jobs guarantee means that it's a guaranteed job, right?
right.
What happens to the racist worker or the sexist worker or the transphobic or homophobic worker who creates a hostile work environment for their fellow employees under a federal jobs guarantee? I have not heard a really good, convincing answer to this yet. And I
Yeah.
voted neg actually twice on this argument in the last 2 weeks because I think it is a very good argument that I'm waiting to find a good answer for. I'm looking for one.
And I mean, the logical like counterpart to that argument is what happens to those marginalized folk that are forced into workspaces that have like those bigoted people, and that's
Well,
interesting.
yeah, I mean that's the
Yeah,
underlying
yeah,
assumption.
that's
Like,
the
do they
underlying concern.
like yeah, like
Yeah.
yeah.
So yeah, it's interesting. I haven't heard that argument, and I don't know what an answer would look like besides like the common saying is that under a jobs guarantee, jobs are made for people instead of people being molded into jobs. So I don't really know what that would look like because obviously you don't want people to have those opinions in the first place. But if they do you just put them in a space that they can't express that to anyone? Like, do they work on their own? Are they an independent contractor? Like, I don't know what that would look like. So
Yeah, I think one of the only things that I've kind of come up with is that you have some sort of ethical code that
okay.
exists for all federal workers, and there are those federal ethics work codes for federal workers at different levels. Level of top secret clearance, all of that that may address those issues. I just haven't been able to delve into some of those federal ethics codes, but I think the enforcement mechanisms may be there. It's just going to take some research to try and find them. Um,
Right.
but I still think it's a very effective neg argument, especially when the AF is talking about creating better work environments for minority workers or women workers because there are job guarantee evidence that says that they help specifically women get out of poverty and out of bad situations, and minority workers rise out of poverty. But like if they're going into a hostile work environment, that could be problematic.
Agreed. And I mean, I saw in the news like maybe a month and a half ago about Trump having gutted the diversity training. So
That
I
was
know
the
it's not
link
the same
evidence.
thing, but it shows that, there's something that has existed. So it's definitely possible. So it's just about finding it.
Yeah. I mean, the link evidence was basically like the federal government now is getting rid of diversity training.
Right.
Like it was all basically like they're setting the stage for just racist incidents at job guarantee
Right.
sites.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, like I think that's a very good negative argument, and it's probably a true argument in some sense. Like
Yeah.
if it's guaranteed, there's just a little recourse. It's got to be like very blatant, probably, and
Right.
even then, who knows? Final thing I just want to talk about really quick is critical ground on the topic. It's ripe for advantage counter plans. There's a lot of util arguments. There aren't as many traditional fill arguments, but there are a lot of K arguments that exist on this topic. What are your thoughts?
So we alluded before to some cap arguments. So I'm going to kind of skip over those because we already talked a little bit about those. But I would say that I think ableism goes af. I think there's great ableism af ground. As I said before, jobs would be created for people instead of people being created for jobs. And that's just essential in the ableism literature.
So
Modern
I
yeah.
want to just cut in there for a second because I have a flip side on that one.
Oh, okay,
Is
go for
that
it.
well, yeah, that's the purpose of the jobs guarantee. We've seen historically work programs be significantly for infrastructure development jobs, construction jobs, physical labor jobs. Uh, there is some good evidence that says that the program itself may not be able to create enough jobs for disabled workers,
Really?
right?
Okay.
Yeah. So Well, I agree with you that like there is a good amount of AF literature there. I think it's also a good neg argument too, especially when the AF is like infrastructure development jobs. That's all that's guaranteed. Construction, rural farm labor, things like that. You can get a very good argument that would say that like a segment of the people that need this income are left out.
Right. That's very interesting. Oh, and that's especially concerning when you go back to the trade-off arguments that you made that you mentioned at the very beginning, because if that costs a trade-off with like, disability coverage or unemployment or things like that for folks that are structurally excluded from the modern economy and they're still excluded post fiat, that's really concerning because those programs would ostensibly go away, but they still are left jobless.
Yeah,
So,
even if they don't necessarily go away, they become even further stigmatized because
right.
why do we need these programs? Everybody should be working, would kind
Right.
of be the argument that gets created. But there's a segment of society that's usually invisible.
Right.
And that's like the disabled body that's usually deemed disposable in society. It's not worth it. But like, we should be promoting these people. They have skills, they have talent. Everybody
Yes,
has a thing they can do to society. So like I
exactly.
think the ideal world, I think durable fiat maybe you can
Right.
even argue um, that would solve for that. But I think it's something that needs to be addressed and thought about on both sides.
Agree. That definitely is a debate to be had. In terms of other critical things, I would say probably like a neoliberalism critique on the neg. Just like this, and again, this would be another really good debate that I would love to adjudicate because the affirmative could make a very convincing argument that the AF is what's called a non-reformist reform because this changing the economy in such a drastic way is a large step away from capitalism and the way that the modern economy functions. Would we be living in a non-capitalist state? No, we would still be in capitalism, but it would be a much more inclusive economy. But that that re-explanation, which I meant to say as an answer to the neoliberalism critique, actually sort of links harder into the critique because it just proves that we're trying to make the economy, which the critique would say is a violent place, more inclusive and just expand its grasp and its tentacles outwards, which is the crux of neoliberalism.
It tries to control the violence within the economic system, and that's all a
Exactly.
jobs guarantee does is
And
try to
by
limit
making
that.
it look, diverse and inclusive, it's able to continue its triumphant march onward and just, into infinity.
Yet
So,
it's still a system of haves and haves not because the jobs guarantee is really only going to raise people slightly above whatever the poverty line is. And that's still not really having a significant amount compared to, most private industry and
right.
things like that.
It also, just a quick offshoot, it also just like begs the question of like, what would happen to like billionaires? Obviously, they would still be in their place, but like that's something that I guess the only thing that might affect it is if like normal means is like a living wage that might have something to do with like the accumulation of wealth. But it's interesting because usually on economic issues like this, you immediately think about the wealthiest of the wealthy. But on this topic, it seems to just wholeheartedly this program just it's I don't think it raises taxes or anything, so it seems to completely ignore that. Like it
I've
does.
seen it go both ways a little bit. Like they
Okay.
do raise taxes to fund the programs, but they bring back in revenue and stuff like that.
Right. So yeah, it could
Um,
go both ways. But other than that, I think that's the top level like critique arguments that I've heard so far. Have you heard any that we haven't mentioned?
I mean, I've heard a couple of like semiotics arguments,
Yeah.
the symbolism of jobs, and like the language behind work, and like what that, talks about, Joe Biden talks about the dignity of work all the time. And there's a
Right.
lot of like semiotics within the language of that phrase of the dignity to work,
Right.
within like capitalist literature, but still it's all anti-capitalist,
Right. It,
critiques.
it's actually really interesting you said that because I just remembered something. The round that I judged with the non-topical cap af that I discussed earlier, the one NC was fantastic. I loved the one NC. The one NC was a like Baudrillard, but it wasn't traditional. Just like like I'm gonna read a Baudrillard critique to waste time. It was actually like rigorously engaging with like instead of reading the economy through Marx's labor theory of value, reading it through the sign theory of value. And it was this corner of Baudrillard that like I knew existed, but also like I had never seen explicitly used in debate. And that's what Baudrillard wrote about. He wrote about reformulating our understanding of the economy through a semiotic lens. And it just it engaged so well with the Marx. And I really enjoy judging that. So I think that is another sort of semiotic take that you can take on the topic about how we need to understand things not through material, but through the symbolic.
Yeah, it definitely was like semiotics, I think, is a really interesting way to go through the topic.
For sure.
So I guess to sum up what we've kind of talked about here tonight, it seems both of us haven't heard or thought of any kind of really out there interpretations on the topic. It's a pretty stable topic for the most part of how people are interpreting it.
Right.
The frameworks haven't been, there have been some pretty normal Kantian-based frameworks, pretty normal util frameworks, a couple of political philosophy ones, but for the most part, I haven't heard anything too out there. Some anti-capitalist roll of the ballots have been some of the most. So it seems like the topic has a fairly grounded and normal, approach compared to other topics. There isn't anything too unique to this one.
I agree. And I think the unfortunate thing that always happens in November, December is just that there's so many less tournaments on this topic than there are on other topics, especially when you have January, February coming right after. And especially when a lot of tournaments that are in mid to late December just use January, February to get a head start on that debate. And it's just unfortunate that it's a necessary evil because obviously schools have winter break and Thanksgiving break and stuff. So there's naturally less tournaments, but this is a topic that I just really like. So I wish that, it wasn't November, December.
Agreed.
But
yeah, it's a very good topic. I think there's a lot of interesting ground on both sides.
Agreed.
Well, for all of us here at Champions Briefs, I want to thank you for watching this video, TA. I'm Daniel Shatzkin.
I'm Charles Karcher.
Thank you for joining us.